So when you walk in a park, you look at the trees, the flowers, the grass, and wonder about where did this come from? Whether they came from seed or another blade of grass, or even a simple bacterium you're looking at in a microscope. Where did that bacterium come from? So it is what is defined or described in cell theory. So the living organisms or a cell always come from a pre-existing cell. The unit of life, whether it's a big tree or an elephant or a simple bacterium, the unit is a cell. So that is also a part of the cell theory. So in this chapter that we are going to look at the different parts of the cell and what they do, we need to understand how the structure of each component relates to its function. Okay? So before we even get started with the individual parts of the cell and how it is related to their function, first we need to look at how are we going to study the cell. Okay, to study the cell, you must ask questions like, okay, what do they look like? What is the color? What is the size? And then you ask the question as to what do they do? How do they do that? So these are the questions that you ask, as scientists ask, when they study cell structure and their function. So the first part of that chapter talks about methodology as to how we use microscope, or we use centrifuges or gel electrophoresis to observe the cell, isolate the components such as chloroplast or mitochondria, DNA or protein, separate them in the gel electrophoresis and study their function. So that is the first part. The next then we are moving on to comparing simple organisms such as a bacteria or prokaryotes without any nucleus with eukaryotes that with nucleus that are either unicellular or multicellular. But in this chapter, we are going to focus on just at the cellular level. We are not going into the organism level, at the multicellular organism. So within that overview, you're going to compare a prokaryote, that's a bacteria, and an archaea, and an eukaryote, such as a protist, plant, fungi, or animal. Once we complete covering that comparison of the different types of cells, we move into describing the eukaryotic cell. So within the eukaryotic cell, the center of the whole cell, you find nucleus, and we start with that center nucleus. It doesn't have to be always at the center of the cell, but it is central to the function of the cell and to the structure of the cell that contains the genetic information DNA, from which you make RNA, and the RNA is processed within that nucleus and comes out of that. And then the mRNA is the one the ribosomes recognize and make proteins out of. So the next part we are going to look at is the structure of the nucleus and ribosomes and how they do, what they do, and so on. Then we get into endomembrane system. So endo means inside, and the membrane network inside the cell, starting with rough endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, lysosome, peroxisome, vacuoles, and plasma membrane. All these are interconnected in some way or the other because these membranes are made up of phospholipids or proteins that come from ribosome, and they can fuse with one another, and they're connected to one another through some vesicles or through direct contact. Okay? So once we complete that, then we look at energy organelles that make energy, that utilize existing energy, and also store carbohydrates as well as make ATP. So those are chloroplasts, that is photosynthesis, and also amino acid biosynthesis. But once it makes the sugars, mitochondria inside the cell, along with other enzymes in the cytoplasm, extract energy in the form of ATP. So that is what we will look at in the energy organelles. Then we transition to cytoskeleton. Cyto is cell, skeleton is the framework within the cell that are made up of proteins. So there are three elements of cytoskeleton: microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments. So we are going to look at the structure of all these things and what they do. Last, we come kind of out of the cell, where the cell membrane encloses the cell, and that's what kind of defines the cell. Then the cell wall in plants, fungi, and some protists, as well as bacteria, that protects the cell and also helps in molecules going in and out of the cell, selective permeability, in addition to the plasma membrane. So the multicellular organism, in addition to having the cell membrane, they also have cell junctions, how the two cells are connected together. So that would be kind of completing the whole cell structure function, starting with a methodology, an overview, and from inside out into the cell surface. So we cover the entire cell structure function. This is a very important chapter that you need to learn and remember. So the structure relates to function. So when you look at a structure of a nucleus or the nuclear membrane or the DNA, how does it relate to the function? Or you look at the structure of chloroplast, the outer membrane, inner membrane, thylakoid, stroma. Try to understand how such structures help in performing photosynthesis and so on. So remember that structure relates to function. That's a big idea. It's the main focus of this chapter. But also you need to know the details of each structure and what they do.